And where's Annie? If you can join us, that'd be great. Terrific. Well, greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeff Tabelko. I'm fortunate to be a colleague of Paulo's here at the center and be able to moderate and play traffic cop to this afternoon's or this morning's conversation. We're going to kick it off with some quick responses, some discussant comments from two leaders in the field who are very familiar to all of us. Tom Lovejoy from the Heinz Center and Mark London from London and Mead, and author of The Last Forest. I'm going to turn the floor over to them for some initial comments, and then we will have an active discussion with all of our panelists, engaging with all of you in the audience. We have many, many experts and a terrific resources in the audience here, and so we want to have a lively exchange and discussion there. So I think I will throw it to Tom without further ado for some initial remarks.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Well, obviously, we had a very informative and I would say very encouraging session this morning. A lot of wonderful, creative, and progressive initiatives in the state of Mato Grosso, particularly around the agricultural enterprise.
Yeah, turn on the microphone.
Oh, sorry. It's on? Yeah.
He's not hearing. Go, sir.
And there's some really interesting things going on. I know, for example, although we didn't get into this kind of detail this morning, that there's some land management going on in which for a year or two soy is grown on the land, and then in the third year or something like that it is used for cattle. It gives the landowner the flexibility to switch back and forth depending on which commodity is the more attractive for him to be marketing. And it also allows cattle ranching to become more intensive. So one of the really interesting things here is how to use the already converted land in more intensive and more productive ways. And as we look ahead for the next 100 years or so with burgeoning human populations and food needs and biofuel needs, clearly the ability to produce more intensively with minimal side effects is an important part of the upcoming agenda. I think we touched on one really important point, which is the land titling issue in the Brazilian Amazon. And I know that's a concern of the Minister for Strategic Affairs, Roberto Mangabeira Ungar. And certainly John Carter brought home very forcefully the really important point that until there is payment to people for using the land and using the forest in ways that doesn't destroy the land or destroy the forest, beyond the more organized forms of agriculture, that we will see just a continuation of the problems of deforestation in the northern part of the state. So I think there's broad agreement amongst us all at this table, and I would say spreading around the world, that this is really a hugely important part of what one might call the ultimate global arrangement for planetary management. One point which was not touched on, and I think is really important, is the hydrological cycle of the Amazon, in which the Amazon essentially generates a significant fraction of its own rainfall. And what we know today that we didn't when that work was first elaborated by excellent Brazilian science, is that when that moisture ultimately hits the high wall of the Andes, some of it, a significant fraction of it, is deflected south to Mato Grosso, further south in Brazil, and to northern Argentina. So the Amazon as a rain machine, or as my friend Paolo Sotero calls it much more poetically, the rivers in the sky, is an essential part of sustainable agriculture and agro-industry in that part of Brazil. And the change in climate that's been detected in the Amazon could as likely be from the amount of deforestation that has already taken place rather than climate change itself. So I know that sometimes it seems it's very frustrating to people that 80% of any property in the Amazon is required to stay in forest. That's going to be essential if we're going to keep that rain machine in place and have a healthy agro industry. And the last point I'd like to make was it was a very interesting point made that where there is soy, there is not a fire problem. Where things are more organized, which is the case where soy is, there is not a fire problem. And the sort of issue was made that once logistics and governance arrives at a frontier area, that you begin to get a conversion to a more orderly form of development and less fire. I think there's a more complicated story there that needs to be teased apart. Because some logistics and infrastructure has historically almost uniformly led to disorderly development. So at some point, I think there will need to be some real attention paid to how to unravel the various elements of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I have spent 25 years looking at the Amazon. I wrote my first book in 1983, and then the second book came out last year. I have, I'm not sure that's me. I have spent a considerable amount of time. I think everybody up here, let me just knock these off. I think we're all. Yeah, I think you actually have to. I think you have to actually.
Take the
Yeah,
battery out.
it's done. I've spent quite a bit of. I've spent a long time talking about these issues with Tom, who was a great friend of mine 25 years ago when I needed a friend when I was starting this, and then 5 years ago I met Governor Maggi, who had a very controversial reputation around the world, and I've spent time with him both in Mato Grosso and here in Washington, talking through issues with him. And I tell Colonel Maya that I try to take credit for the greening of Blairo Maggi, but I think that Blairo Maggi was very receptive to the issues about the environment back in 2003 when I first met him. It's just that he was the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and everybody was afraid to confront him and talk to him. Since then, people have engaged him in dialogue, and they have found that he is a very perceptive and sensitive and caring person about the environment, because he knows that if something happens to the environment, or as Tom says, something happens to the water cycle, it's bad for business. I want to start the discussion today with Tom and with Governor Maggi on a particular issue. Let me give you a little context. I've worked over the last year and a half with Governor Braga in Amazonas to create a program which now is part of the Amazon Sustainable Foundation, which has 17 million hectares. And from that 17 million hectares, we've put aside 600,000 and created a joint venture with Marriott, where the Marriott guests from around the world can carbon neutralize themselves by putting in $1 to their room rates, and that dollar will go into Brazil and work, and it goes to the Amazon Sustainable Foundation. This is all Brazilian. There's no NGO involvement. There's no American involvement other than the flow of funds. And this program has created what is basically the guardians of the forest. The people who live in this reserve, the 600,000 hectare reserve, will take care of the reserve. They take care of the monitoring and the enforcement. We're creating sustainable economies there. We already have the J.W. Marriott School. It was their idea to name it after Mr. Marriott, not ours. It has a Skype connection. It has potable water. It has nets on all of the dwellings. And all of this was part of a contract, a written contract, which exists between the people who live in this reserve and this Amazon Sustainable Foundation, that in return for the resources to have sustainable and productive lives, they will not deforest. And the reason people deforest is because they need money. Well, not deforesting will give these people who live in the reserve not only income, but health care, educational opportunities, and economies to learn from. And so it's kind of a model of what I call positive environmentalism. That is, instead of telling people what not to do, you incentivize them for doing the right thing. And that's a long way of an introduction to an issue in Mato Grosso, because one thing about the Amazon is that one size does not fit all. Some of you, and I know Tom, we've been to many, many places in the Amazon, and what's good in Rondonópolis, which is at the southern end, is not good for San Gabriel da Cachoeira, which is farther north. And I think that the program in Amazonas may not work as well in parts of Mato Grosso. But Tom and I were in Tennessee a couple weeks ago, and Tom talked about the importance of focusing on degraded land, of bringing degraded land back into production in the water cycle and putting it into the carbon cycle. And so I want to talk, I'd like Tom to address the importance of the scope of the degraded land, the importance of bringing it back, and then I'd like the governor, this is not a setup because the governor and I had a long discussion about this earlier this year. What are some of the ideas that Mato Grosso could do, or that the Brazilian government could do, to incentivize people to use degraded land rather than deforest land to bring that into production? So, Tom, why don't you first talk about the issue?
So, very briefly, if one thinks about the climate change issue, it's basically driven by distortions of the global carbon cycle. And an important piece of that has been in current biological carbon being destroyed and going into the atmosphere. So in the last 3 centuries, 200 to 250 billion tons of carbon have been stripped from natural ecosystems and released into the atmosphere. And the point here is that a significant fraction of that, and I would hesitate to put a precise number on it, but I think at least maybe 100 billion tons, could be pulled back out of the atmosphere by restoring ecosystems, putting carbon back into soils. Like in the American prairie region, there used to be 25% of the soil was carbon. Now it's 2%. I mean, it gives you some sense of how significant these numbers could be. And in terms of grazing land, if you restore grazing land and capture the carbon and put it back into the natural biodiversity, what do you get? You get better grazing land. You're not taking anything away from anybody. So this is my big new focus, is what do we need to learn about recarbonizing, restoring the terrestrial ecosystems, which at the same time would make them more resilient in the face of climate change, and how might be the best ways to put this into international policy and provide resource flows to encourage that.
Bem, na minha avaliação, o que nós temos que nos preocupar com o uso melhor do solo é, de fato, dar uma ocupação para esse solo. No Brasil, nós temos muitas áreas que nós chamamos de áreas marginais, que são áreas que não são propícias à produção de grãos, ou que podem produzir grãos, mas tem uma certa vulnerabilidade, tem um risco maior de você não colher isso no final final da safra, ou colher e não ter resultados econômicos suficientes. Então, o que tem sido feito? Essas áreas têm se deixado de lado e sempre se buscar áreas onde o clima é melhor, onde chove melhor, onde você tem uma infraestrutura melhor. Bem, o Brasil, nesse momento, ele vem fazendo uma reocupação, então, dessas terras, como foi uma recarbonificação, né, dessas terras, através da plantação de cana-de-açúcar. O grande salto que o Brasil tem dado na questão do etanol não está relacionado com a questão amazônica, mas está relacionado exatamente no ponto de fazer com que as terras que não estavam sendo bem ocupadas, que não tinham uma boa rentabilidade no agronegócio, possam ser utilizadas então para a produção do etanol, que é a substituição de uma pastagem fraca, onde você tem uma ocupação muito pequena de quantidade de gado por hectare, transformando isso então em algo muito mais produtivo como a produção do etanol. Então, o caminho que o Brasil tem seguido é exatamente esse que foi sugerido aqui, de reocupar, de reordenar a ocupação das terras que foram feitas de forma desordenada. Quer dizer, começou a se abrir aqui, não é muito bom, vamos para frente, e isso agora parou. Não se vai mais à frente, mas sim se busca fazer aquilo que ficou para trás, que não estava sendo utilizado e possa ser utilizado. Outro ponto que também depende muito de quanto cada produtor ou cada cultura possa ser rentável, o quanto de dinheiro ele coloca no bolso desse proprietário no final do ano, também pode ser ocupada para outras culturas, como milho, como soja, como arroz, mas significa temos que lançar mão de equipamentos, de recursos, como irrigação e outras técnicas que hoje no Brasil é muito caro ainda a questão da irrigação. Então, nós podemos reaproveitar as terras que nós temos, são milhões e milhões de hectares que o Brasil tem, que pode ajudar sim na produção de biocombustível, na produção de alimentos, sem a necessidade de novos desmatamentos ou abertura da Amazônia. Acho que esse é o propósito que o governo do presidente Lula, que o nosso ministro, o Mink, vem trabalhando, e nós estamos plenamente convencidos também de que esse é o caminho. O Maicon Londo falou bem aqui, ele foi um dos que me alertou lá atrás, alguns anos atrás, de que o caminho que nós seguimos no Mato Grosso, o caminho que nós seguimos no Brasil não era o caminho correto. E eu disse hoje aqui, e disse acho que ontem numa das palestras, enquanto só os ambientalistas falavam para mim, estava um pouco difícil de acreditar. Mas depois que os cientistas sentaram e discutiram e deram um alerta ao mundo, não cabe mais a nós fazermos contestações sobre isso, mas sim ajudar a empurrar a coisa para que efetivamente elas possam acontecer.
Thank you very much, Governor. I think that's a very good point for us to then open the discussion on and bring our audience into it. As my colleagues have microphones, we ask that you use a microphone and let us know who you are before you pose your question, so our panelists would know. Who would like to kick off and continue our discussion with the first question? About John Pielemeyer in the middle there.
Eu vou falar em inglês. Português é bem fraco agora. I had the pleasure of serving twice in Brazil with USAID, and I want to identify two problems that relate to what you're discussing. I think as a general approach, the thesis that seems very positive. And if you add leadership and potentially American leadership to this package, it would perhaps bring Brazil and America together on a convergence on some policies, international policies. Two questions. First, in the early days when I first went to Brazil in the 70s, there was a major partnership between U.S. agriculture universities and Brazilian universities helping to build the agricultural research program and the seed multiplication program in Brazil. And that partnership really was fortified with generations of Brazilian graduate students coming to the U.S. for education. And most of those people are now in key positions in Brazil. And there is a potential for, I think, continuing relationship between U.S. universities and Brazilian universities, as well as with the private sector. That relationship stopped because of perceived competition between American farmers and Brazilian farmers in the Bumpers Amendment. That seems to me to continue to be an issue to the degree we could cooperate positively on issues like this. The second issue relates to payment for services, which you're all putting forward as a potential resolution. If you sat around your Thanksgiving table with your relatives from the Midwest or the South, as I did, bailouts and payments for services are not very popular right now. The one attractive thing about Brazil, it seems to me, is that if you look outside the environmental sector, payment for services has already started. You have Pro Familia, which is a program that supports families in poor areas of Brazil. You have an education program that's a model paying people to go to school that's now been copied in Mexico and other places. And you have a health program where you pay people for health services. So perhaps Brazil is the ideal place to think about payment for services because Brazil's already been doing payment for services and hopefully has learned something about how it might be done efficiently in other sectors. Thank you.
Who would like to... Governor?
Sim, pelo menos na primeira parte. De fato, o desenvolvimento da agricultura no Brasil, ela se deu, principalmente nessa agricultura de exportação, não da agricultura familiar, mas dessa agricultura empresarial que nós chamamos no Brasil. Ela se deu, de fato, com uma grande colaboração aqui dos cientistas do governo americano. Se não fosse esse apoiamento, com toda certeza, nós não teríamos o sucesso que tivemos no Brasil. E a formação dos nossos doutores, dos nossos técnicos, foram feitas a partir de convênios com as universidades americanas. E por um determinado tempo, eu também tenho que concordar em que os agricultores brasileiros e os americanos achavam que eram concorrentes no mercado. Mas hoje em dia nós não pensamos mais assim. Nós achamos que nós somos economias complementares, porque aqui se produz numa determinada época do ano e que ele não consegue, a agricultura americana não consegue atender a demanda mundial. Portanto, se não houvesse o hemisfério sul também produzindo, nós teríamos grandes problemas de abastecimento de alimentos no mundo inteiro. As nossas associações aqui, representada pelo Ricardo e pelo Rui, eles têm feito contatos com a Associação Americana de Produtores de Soja e têm percorrido algumas regiões do mundo buscando o mercado comum, tentando abrir esse mercado. Nós demoramos algum tempo no Brasil a nos organizar nesse setor. Embora a soja tenha sido, nos últimos anos, a maior colaboradora da balança comercial, nós nunca tínhamos uma organização montada. E a partir, então, da minha chegada ao governo, nós chamamos os produtores e transferimos a esses produtores parte de recursos do Tesouro do Estado e também os produtores colaboram compulsoriamente, não é por vontade, mas compulsoriamente, quer dizer, obrigatoriamente, eles contribuem para um fundo, onde possibilita, então, que os nossos representantes dessas entidades possam andar pelo mundo afora, não só abrindo novos mercados junto com os produtores americanos, mas também vindo fazer as defesas que nós temos que fazer aqui. E nós retomamos nos últimos anos agora uma parceria, principalmente nós de Mato Grosso, uma parceria com a Universidade de Illinois, onde nós temos estudantes hoje de Mato Grosso estudando nessa universidade e também tem estudantes daqui que vão para a universidade lá para conhecer um pouco das nossas questões. Então, nós concordamos de que foram os Estados Unidos o grande precursor que nos ajudou a formar o que nós somos hoje. Passamos um tempo distante, mas a reaproximação agora é necessária. E principalmente nessas questões ambientais, nós queremos que os Estados Unidos também participem. Eu vi a declaração do presidente Barack Obama há 15 dias atrás, e ele foi muito, muito firme de dizer que daqui para frente, aliás, do dia 20 de janeiro para frente, os Estados Unidos terão uma outra posição o que tiveram até agora. E nós saudamos isso, achamos que é importante, e com toda certeza o Brasil será um grande parceiro nessa área de nós desenvolvermos tecnologias e desenvolvermos as questões ambientais para que a gente possa fazer um enfrentamento com o mundo.
Yes, the gentleman down here.
Thank you. My name is John Redwood, and until recently I was at the World Bank for quite a number of years, working in the past with Mato Grosso and other states in the Amazon and in Brazil more generally. First, I'd like to congratulate the Wilson Center for this excellent panel, but I wanted to follow up with one of the things I think became very clear from several of the presentations, including that by Governor Maggi and by John Carter, and that is the role of cattle. A number of years ago, in fact, we did some analytical work, one of our colleagues, Sergio Margulis, that really showed that the main problem was not soybeans. The problem really was ranching in the Amazon in terms of more current causes of deforestation. Infrastructure, certain types of infrastructure, as Tom reminded us, still is an area of concern, particularly road improvements in areas on the frontier. And I think John pointed out the whole problematic around governance and lack of governance, and the fact that the only way that you're really going to get governance, I think, on the frontier is through economic incentives. I think the panel is absolutely right in this. But I'd also be interested in hearing a bit more from the panel as to what can be done in terms of intensifying cattle ranching in the region, taking advantage of land that's already been deforested. Because I do think this is one of the major challenges. And in addition to making the forest, standing forest, worth more as it is, in other words, payment for environmental services, I think a lot needs to be done in terms of improving, and the governor himself suggested this and the other colleagues from Mato Grosso, the way cattle, which is basically quite extensive now in the Amazon, is being managed. And I think a set of incentives also perhaps needs to be developed in this area, as well as strengthening command and control in areas where governance is already stronger and more possible. Thank you.
John?
Let me give you a real-time answer. On my BlackBerry about an hour ago, I got an email from Brazil that a load of lime that I was sending to my ranch to line pasture to increase productivity couldn't get there. There were no roads, mud. So this whole question, you need to listen to guys on the ground. We're not, this mentality, the Pentagon mentality that tells the grunt out in Iraq what to do, doesn't work. The forests in our region, the Xingu, have all been burned, logged. What's remaining is degraded, and there's no logistics. So what is it going to hurt to take asphalt there? We need that urgently. Brazil, Mato Grosso in particular, doesn't need to be told what to do. They're doing it. They look at their numbers. They 80% increase in productivity with a 30% increase in land mass. They already are intensifying. It already is happening. The thing is that it's happening behind the curve. We need to throw out in front of the curve. So to get logistics to do this, you need the human resources, you need the managers, and you need the landowners who have that sophistication and know how to do it. But otherwise, you're toast. You can't make it work economically. It's just too risky. So it's almost philosophy you need to hear this, because when you're out there on the ground and you see this, it's not so easy. And in order to intensify and to go from 0.8 animal units to 1.5 per hectare, you're only going to do that with one thing, with lime, and with tractors and with diesel and all that stuff. And the further you go north, the further that freight in your basis is, and the basis gets more negative. So it all comes down to numbers.
Eu gostaria de dar uma contribuição também nesse sentido, é que começou há alguns anos já no estado de Mato Grosso, e o nosso colega aqui, produtor João Carter, ele fala muito bem de algumas áreas específicas do Mato Grosso, mas existe uma grande área que faz contato, uma grande área de pecuária que faz contato com uma grande área de agricultura. E aí sim começou a integração agricultura-pecuária e mais ainda, a integração agricultor-pecuarista ou vice-versa. O que é isso? Nós temos a capacidade de produzir, nós agricultores, grãos muito baratos e também resíduos dos grãos nobres como a soja, como o próprio fibras, como o próprio algodão. Então, com esses resíduos, eles estão migrando para grandes áreas de confinamento. Existem algumas áreas que já estão fazendo confinamento em grande escala e isso tem proporcionado a integração agricultor-pecuarista. Existem também pecuaristas que optam por aliviar as suas pastagens e levar esse gado aos confinadores, que normalmente são tradicionais produtores de grãos, causando com isso uma grande sinergia na produção agropecuária do estado de Mato Grosso. Então isso já está demonstrado claramente que existe essa tendência. Como o governador Blairo falou muito bem, é difícil, muitas vezes culturalmente, um pecuarista se transformar num agricultor. Mas o pecuarista utilizar dos resíduos da produção agrícola, utilizar dos grãos baratos que existem no Mato Grosso, isso já está perfeitamente viável. E essa tendência é clara em nosso estado, na medida em que tem aumentado um grande número de confinamentos, já tem aumentado um grande número de parcerias nesse sentido. Então nós acreditamos que com isso vai aliviar essas áreas de pastagem que pode se transformar também em áreas agrícolas e aí sim realimentar o sistema e fazer com que nós sejamos mais eficientes na pecuária, que é o que nós precisamos. E logicamente precisa resolver esse problema de logística, que nem o nosso colega João está dizendo, porque existem áreas no Mato Grosso muito distantes, então é difícil transportar os grãos até lá ou os animais até cá, vamos dizer assim. Então, realmente precisa haver investimentos também em infraestrutura, e isso é uma iniciativa do governador Blairo Maggi, que pode falar mais a respeito dessa integração através de estradas lá no estado.
Você me chamou para chamar? Eu vou fazer um comentário rápido. O meu estado é um estado pobre. Nós não somos nem um estado rico como é o estado americano e os estados americanos. A infraestrutura que nós conseguimos fazer naquele estado foi feita no meu governo em parceria com os produtores rurais. Quando eu cheguei no governo, o estado inteiro tinha 1.940 quilômetros de rodovias asfaltadas. Hoje eu já fiz mais de 3.000 quilômetros de rodovias asfaltadas. Então, em toda a história de Mato Grosso, tinha 1.940 e eu consegui fazer, quer dizer, eu e os produtores fazer mais 3.000 quilômetros. Como? Em parceria. Além do John pagar os impostos todos que ele tem que pagar para produzir no Brasil, ainda o governo vai nele e fala assim, olha, eu preciso de uma colaboração sua, eu preciso de uma participação sua para que a gente possa fazer uma parceria público-privada de um modo bem próprio de Mato Grosso e nós construirmos uma estrada junto, ou juntos. Isso fez com que nós pudéssemos construir mais estradas e nós tiramos da mão do governo a administração dessas estradas e passamos nas mãos dos produtores. Então, ao invés do governo contratar, quem contrata são a associação de produtores. E isso teve um efeito imediato muito interessante. Em 2003, quando assumiu o governo, um custo de uma estrada custava R$600 mil o quilômetro, que na época poderia ser tipo $300 mil o quilômetro. Nas primeiras parcerias que nós fizemos, se vocês terem uma ideia, nós baixamos isso para R$230 mil o quilômetro. Isso também demonstra que os produtores e a sociedade, quando se envolve junto com o governo, todos têm a ganhar. Quer dizer, um governo, eu acho que como aqui também não é diferente lá no Brasil, nós somos muito ruins para gastar, né? Quer dizer, tem muitos entraves e aí os produtores têm nos ajudado muito, então, em criar essa infraestrutura. Agora, isso traz algum problema. A região do John Carter, que ele mostrou aqui, é sem dúvida nenhuma a região mais atrasada do estado de Mato Grosso, onde nós temos mais problemas. E os problemas não são problemas que nasceram ontem ou hoje. São problemas que vêm da década de 70, quando nós começamos a mexer na Amazônia brasileira. Para aquela região foram disponibilizados incentivos fiscais para grandes fazendas, grandes grupos conglomerados da região de São Paulo, onde 300 mil hectares, 500 mil hectares era o padrão de uma fazenda naquela região. E isso fez com que pequenos produtores, milhares de pequenos produtores, vindo principalmente do Nordeste, ficassem à margem do progresso e à margem da oportunidade de ter a terra. E um movimento da Igreja Católica fez com que esses pequenos produtores, num segundo passo, se transformassem em grileiros, podemos dizer assim, que queriam a terra sem ter o direito ou o dinheiro para comprar essa terra. Então, no segundo momento, esses poceiros acabaram ganhando direito à terra, mas o Estado brasileiro não soube, nesse momento, coordenar tudo isso e fazer com que aquele cidadão que teve acesso à terra também pudesse ter acesso ao documento dessa terra e ter recursos suficientes para se desenvolver a atividade econômica. E também o Estado não teve a capacidade de colocar à disposição dele a educação, de colocar lá a governança do Estado, com a presença da polícia, de um delegado, de um promotor público, de um juiz, enfim, o Estado ficou ausente desse processo. Então a região do John Carter é uma região de fato bastante conturbada e bem diferente das demais regiões do estado do Mato Grosso. Ele me liga de vez em quando desesperado para resolver os problemas deles, e a gente tem procurado resolver, mas confesso a vocês que não é uma tarefa muito fácil realmente que a gente tem naquela região.
Thank you. As you look at intensifying cattle production in particular, I would encourage you to look at, as John Carter put it, the trends ahead of the curve, way ahead of the curve in some respects. In the United States here, where we have had considerable intensification, concentration of cattle, there is now a backlash against that. It's coming from two directions. One is from the animal rights movement, and let me say for journalists, let me say off the record, don't quote me on this, I'm amazed at the political traction that movement is having in our Congress. It's quite something. The other place where the backlash is coming from is from municipalities whose local water supplies are being affected by the polluted runoff of the manure from the concentrated animal feeding operations. Ahead of that part of the curve, there is an opportunity. And that opportunity is with slightly less concentration, still more concentration than you currently have in many places in Brazil, but not at the extreme end of concentration that we have here, where we have, for example, in the hog farming area, we have extremely concentrated hog farms with millions of animals in a very tight space. There is a space, I think, for the combination, as you mentioned, of agricultural production and animal production, that is crop production and animal production together, viewed through this prism that Tom Lovejoy has described of recarbonization of degraded lands and looking at opportunities for managing the pollution that's inevitably associated with such operations. Here, let me give an example. We are working with groups of farmers who are taking the manure operation, the manure part of the operation of a moderately concentrated animal program, and using that both for fertilizer, but also for processing methane, a gas which is produced as a waste from manure operations, and that methane can then be used to generate electricity. It reduces greenhouse gas emissions. It reduces the pollution of groundwater. And I call it in English poop to power, or manure to money. This idea of taking the manure aspect of more concentrated animal operations and using it to generate methane, emission reductions, which can be tradable in a carbon market, and an improved local water quality and community environment. I just mentioned these because since, John, you talked about being ahead of the curve, if you are out there ahead of the curve, you want to see things coming at you as well.
You want to respond? Yeah, John?
I just wanted to respond to the governor real quick. In all fairness, Mato Grosso is a phenomenal place to where it is in time, the productivity it's got, that our region is really not indicative of the state. Our region is indicative of the future of the Amazon, of Pará State and Amazonas. It's a little pocket that still is found in Mato Grosso. It's the Mato Grosso from the 80s and 70s that's still there, but I use that just as a case study about how we're going to advance in the Amazon and where we have to have governance. The other issue is about intensification, which is very important. There's no doubt about it. It's not going to stop deforestation. It will help reduce it. But just give you a case study. A guy named Gilmar Pascual, he's a farmer. He borders Governor Maggi's property in Cadencia. And he's a small producer. He's a migrant, moved up, chasing the frontier. He sends his kids through. He survives from farming. He raises soybeans, then he plants corn, and then he seeds grass inside the corn. And he's producing 3 crops. Now, where in the U.S. do you do that? In 1 year with no irrigation, where do you do that? You don't do it. And this guy is a phenomenal man. He's a hero. He's a pioneer for Brazil, and he's doing it. And he can barely make it. He can barely make it. So don't think that that's a solution that's economically viable. This guy's doing everything he can do, and he still wants, looking at that forest, and he said, God, I need to open up some more. And that pressure's still there. So it's not a pipe dream. Well, it is a pipe dream. It could be.
Okay, gentleman here, and then we'll move around. Yeah. So please.
Oh, that's my.
We'll get you a mic here in a
That's my
second.
cricket.
Hello, my name is Mark Lindell. I'm a sector leader for sustainable development for the World Bank in Brazil. And I have a question regarding this use of degraded areas. As we know, part of the degraded areas, on the order of 30 million, 40 million hectares total in the country, part of them are in areas that actually belong to private individuals who have land titles, another part where titles are perhaps not quite as formalized. And I'm curious, when we look around for how to bring in these two different groups, if you will, of users of the land, what instruments beyond those which were mentioned today may already exist in Brazil and could be reformulated? Because if we're talking about over 10 years, I don't know, 10 million hectares, 15 million hectares being rejuvenated to relieve the pressure in a number of areas, and that type of rejuvenation costs on the order of $1,000 a hectare. It's quite a multi-billion-dollar endeavor. And I wonder if we've thought at all about the possibility that there exists in Brazil programs for regional development, one particular, the Constitutional Fund for the North, which makes funds and has made as much as $2 or $3 billion a year available for the development of the northern region, in which Mato Grosso is included, a large part of which has gone to agriculture and livestock. Fortunately now, the use of those funds is conditional on demonstrating sustainability. I wonder if that can be further adjusted to target this regeneration issue, making capital available to those who would like to use it over a much longer period necessary, maybe as many as 15 or 20 years, and potentially even moving to the use of that fund in a grant way, not requiring repayment, but actually recognizing the positive externality for the world, and certainly Brazil, and the rain cycle throughout the country. So I wonder if is that a possibility to consider?
Okay. Tom, would you like to start? Discussion?
Well, would I like to start? No, actually, because I don't know that much about some of the possible mechanisms. But I am certainly thinking about this not only in terms of resources available within Brazil, but resources that could flow from outside of Brazil and to many other countries to just bring back these natural ecosystems to both a more useful state and one that actually has more carbon in them. And this idea is so new, it's like 5 weeks old, that all I can give you is the big broad outline.
If I could just comment, my organization, Environmental Defense Fund, has a partnership with a group of farmers in Kansas. And those farmers are experimenting with a whole range of recarbonization techniques, including, as Governor Maggi has pointed out, is being done extensively in Brazil, no-till farming, which leaves the farmers in Kansas call it trash farming. You leave the residue from last year's crop on top of the soil instead of clearing it off or burning it. And those residues, the stalks, the stems, the leaves, they're made of carbon too, and they go into the soil and make the soil richer. When that happens, they restore the porousness of the soil, the ability of the soil to act as a sponge to store water. That means their farms are experiencing less runoff than their neighbors' farms where tillage is common. In addition, they are planting trees along stream boundaries, stream borders, rather than grazing cows or planting corn and soy right up to the edge of the stream. The trees help further reduce runoff and improve stream quality and improve habitat for fish. Where you get more fish in streams, you get other wildlife coming in to eat the fish. Their replanting of trees and cover crops as well is improving the habitat for different species of birds that need the forest areas and need the cover crop areas to make their nests and reproduce. So they're getting a significant wildlife benefit simply from managing what in fact, as Dr. Lovejoy has described, is managing for carbon. The key from an incentive point of view to encourage them to do that is to compensate them for that. And for every ton of carbon they can sequester in the soil, in the trees, and let me give an even further example of how this works. When they reduce the runoff into streams, in areas where there is a possibility to produce electricity from low-head hydroelectric power, if you are reducing the runoff of soil and other nutrients into the stream, your dams that you use to create that hydroelectric power don't silt up as rapidly. So we're also working with farmers and forest landowners in the southeastern United States, where some of the largest U.S. electric utilities have big dams, and the dams are silting up. The electric utilities have a double interest in wanting to pay farmers to manage their lands in a more carbon restorative way, because there's a carbon benefit to be gained, which is valuable in a carbon market, and you don't have to clean out your dam as frequently, which is a very expensive operation if you're generating hydroelectric power. So there are a number of potential benefits that can be harvested. The key is to get the economic incentives right. And from my perspective, what is crucial is to open carbon markets in the United States and internationally to improvements in carbon sequestration and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions through these practices. I think that we can envision in the future in Brazil a domestic, made in Brazil policy framework in which those kinds of carbon improvements are creditable in a Brazil domestic carbon market and also sellable in a global carbon market. And I think those kinds of policy tools can do more to incentivize the carbon restoration than any other tool we have available right now.
Governor, did you have?
Só comentário rápido. No estado de Mato Grosso, essa preocupação que a senhora Anne colocou já é uma realidade. Nós lá, nós temos, por lei, a obrigação de deixarmos todas as margens de rios sem que seja utilizado. Porém, como nós dissemos antes, nós cometemos os nossos erros e hoje o setor produtivo, tanto da soja quanto do boi, do algodão, da cana-de-açúcar, todos esses segmentos produtivos assinaram já protocolos com o governo do Estado, independente de pressão do Ministério Público ou não, de retornar ao sistema ambiental todas essas áreas. Em 10 anos, nós queremos que todas as áreas que foram ocupadas irregularmente nessa questão do meio ambiente possam ser devolvidas, então, para que, como a senhora fez o comentário, que o ciclo de vida volte absolutamente ao normal, sem nenhum problema no nosso Estado.
Annie, you're right on target about the carbon. Case study. We have a property that's in our system. It's a guy runs 120,000 head of cattle. So you can imagine how much land he's got and how much he deforested. He's a great man. He's a pioneer spirit. Tore down all the riparian zones, all the forests along the streams, because way back when the government asked you to do that because of malaria. And so he's got, I don't know how many hundreds of kilometers of streams he's got to reforest. And then, so what we've done in our system, we've mapped out all the properties, including the head of this watershed called the Suyamisu, which starts at a little stream called Tangura, which is on Grupo Magi's property. So water comes into the property, the scientists measure it, they measure it on the exit of the property, all the way downstream till it hits the Xingu National Park. The testing for contamination, silting, what have you. We've mapped out through a doctoral thesis all the riparian zones have been degraded, and how many hectares that is and how many tons of carbon that represents over a 20-year period. It's 250 million tons just in riparian zones. To reforest that, let's talk about numbers. It's not $1,000. I wish it was. It's between 3,000 to 10,000 reais per hectare. So it's anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000 a hectare to reforest that. And come into the Kyoto, into the clean mechanism route. If you go in the volunteer carbon way, then you got carbon that's so cheap it doesn't even compensate you for it. So we didn't take no for an answer, and we went after aggressively people to buy our carbon. And we got Rabobank, which is the largest ag lending bank, and they're actively paying us to reforest these riparian zones. They're giving money. They're paying. They're not giving us, okay, we're going to give you $2,000. They said, we'll pay your cost, and we're going to use technology produced on his property, the governor's property, through Woods Hole Research Center, the least cost method to reforest native forest in that state. And so that applied science is being applied directly in the system, and we're getting paid for it. I got a check a few weeks ago for my property. So this is a pilot project that if the world and if our government in the United States signs this, it will be a watershed. We will have 20% more forest in Mato Grosso in 10 years just in riparian zones. Guaranteed. Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. It's already happening. So it's very positive.
Okay, terrific. We had a number of questions. I think what we may do is also for the panelists, we'll capture a couple of them and then let you respond. So, sir, if you could kick us off and let us know who you are.
Frank McCann from the University of New Hampshire. I've been watching this process for 40 years now, and some of the comments have strike me as I don't know, almost humorous. I thought John's comment about the roads was well taken, but you know, if you look at the history of Amazonia and the experience with BR 364, you have to wonder about the wisdom of paving roads, because the destruction in Rondônia was so evident. But there are a couple of things I'm sort of curious about. The expansion of soy from Rio Grande do Sul up into Mato Grosso in the early 1970s, eventually led to the movement of cattle from Rio Grande up into Mato Grosso. That had sort of an unintended consequence of bringing weeds and ivy and I'm not sure what else into the Pantanal, which I'm sure that the governor is very aware of. And I'm curious. I'm a historian, so I don't know about these things, but I'm really curious about what the weeds that I saw in the northern Pantanal are absolutely just choking off life of plants of all kinds, and I wonder how far that goes into other parts of the state as cattle moves in other places, and also related to the soy in the south. When they started soy in Rio Grande do Sul, that was followed rather quickly by severe cancers caused by the fertilizer that ran into the streams. Again, I'd be kind of curious as to what does the lime you're talking about, what does that do to the the human ecosystem? And I think two other points. One, I'd be very hesitant to use any references to farming development in the United States, and the inability of the United States to protect, as John mentioned, the Dakotas. Remember that the inability to protect land in the American West was based heavily on racism. If it hadn't been such a racist country, the Army would have been there to do things that it should have been doing rather than finding gold in the Black Hills. And for others who aren't terribly familiar with the Cerrado, I think it's worth mentioning that the leading specialists of the 1950s and early 60s were arguing, as did Preston James, a geographer who had the basic textbook that was studied for Brazilian geography. The Cerrado was thought to be absolutely unfarmable. James wrote rather vehemently that you'd have to dynamite to plow in that area. So it's kind of encouraging to hear about tilling without cutting into the soil.
Sure.
A couple of points. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As I mentioned, I think we'll take a couple because we have so many hands. I believe lady in the back right there. Yes, please. And then we'll come down here and come over here.
My name's Anita Parlow. I'm an advisor to CEOs in sugar industry, and I know this is not on the topic, but just a quick question, which is what implications, if any, if the U.S. were to reduce or eliminate its 54-cent a gallon tariff on the importation or exporting of sugar ethanol into the U.S. markets, what kind of implications might there be in Brazil with respect to environment, social, labor?
Okay, thank you also for your brevity. Yeah, right over here. John?
Thank you very much. John Matuzak, the Director for Sustainable Development at the State Department. Just a comment, you've all made a references to the discussions going on in the Framework Convention and climate change, but there is another forum in which agriculture and environment will be discussed at this coming year, which is an important one where I think that your voices would be particularly useful, and this is the policy year at the UN Commission on Sustainable Development, which had its beginning certainly at the Rio Development Conference and with the launch of Agenda 21. That will take place in May for 2 weeks, and agriculture and rural development will be a major focus of that. And the sustainable consumption and production aspects of agriculture and rural development will be a major point of discussion there. There will be policy recommendations that come out of there, and it's extremely important that we have the voice of practitioners and of local authorities and scientists. I think that a lot of the idea and a lot of the voices that have been presented here, be it from the Alliance, or from the government of Mato Grosso, or this idea on carbon capture in agricultural lands, in degraded lands, all get brought there, because for the most part it will be policy people from governments negotiating policy recommendations which are often devoid of actual substance, unfortunately too much in terms of practitioners that are on the ground and actually have a real experience. Brazil and the United States have tended to work very closely and well together because of our large land mass and the frontiers that we have had on these kinds of issues of sustainable development and how to go forward. But I would encourage you to look for ways, and we would be happy to work with you and possibly with the federal government of Brazil to make certain that your voices could be heard at that forum in New York in May. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, John. Why don't we take that bunch, and then we'll come back around for some more questions. John, you want to kick it?
Yeah, I'm going to respond to the question from New Hampshire. I think that position's silly. I don't want to be rude, but Yosemite National Park in 1888, after our frontiers officially closed, had no Indians in it, and it had squatters, loggers tearing it down. We had to send in the cavalry there for 10 years to protect one of our first national parks. So you look at Meriwether Lewis. Before we had one road going across from St. Louis west, he knew it, and he said it's going to go. And you look at Brazil, Orlando Villas Boas in the Roncador expedition that went up to Mato Grosso in the 40s. That started the process, and there's no way to stop it. Hey, no way. And the road's going to do it a lot quicker, and there's no doubt about it. And if you're a armchair warrior looking at a satellite image and you can see those roads and it's being deforested, that's fine. But when you're there and you see dirt roads that go for 400 kilometers and all the forest is burned, charred, whatever, and you've got people that want to go in there and want to do the right thing that can't stand logistics, and you might change your opinion. Take lime out of the system. We knock out world agriculture by 40%. I mean, you can't farm pH of 4 if you don't lime it. So that is an issue. It is part of production. We're very concerned about it to the extent that these buffer zones of 50 meters, we don't have that in the U.S. We should have 50-meter buffer zones in all our streams. And when you fly in an airplane across the eastern United States, which is all temperate forest, you don't have it. And so I think that's a real issue. We have to deal with it, and we are trying to, and we're trying to do it pragmatically and also objectively. Thank you.
Okay. Others, any comments on CSD as another opportunity? Plans for people to be active there? Or
it's useful.
Só respondendo a questão do início da agricultura no Brasil, com casos de câncer e outras coisas parecidas, é uma coisa que já ficou para trás na história brasileira. O uso sem conhecimento de produtos agroquímicos como toxafeno, DDT e outros agentes que se usavam no passado, hoje foram banidos. E os casos que ocorreram não foram pelo uso de fertilizantes, mas sim pelo uso de químicos que não se tinha um controle, não se tinha um conhecimento e não se tinha o que tem hoje, uma rastreabilidade do processo, desde o dia da formulação desse produto até o momento em que você tem consumido ele na propriedade rural.
Eu queria dar uma contribuição também com relação à migração de bovinos do sul para o centro-oeste. O que ocorre, o que ocorreu é que os bovinos que são adaptados ao centro-oeste, na região de Cerrado, que é a região de solos fracos e se inseriu ali as braquiárias, são de origem indiana, são bovinos Nelore, a maior parte da raça é Nelore. Os bovinos que estão no Rio Grande do Sul, eles são de outra origem, de origem europeia, Bostauros. Então não existe assim essa migração física do animal que está no Rio Grande do Sul para o centro-oeste. O que existiu foi o desenvolvimento e a formação de novos rebanhos no centro-oeste, adaptados àquela região de clima, temperatura, solo, enfim, todas as adaptações. Com relação a pragas no Pantanal, eu não pude compreender, eu não sei que pragas que são essas que os bovinos levaram ao Pantanal. Hoje o que existe no Pantanal hoje é uma iniciativa de turismo, já existe alguma coisa relacionada muito importante que é o turismo, e existe uma pecuária estabelecida ali muito forte do ponto de vista de adaptação dos bovinos àquela região. Existem bovinos lá há mais de 200, 300 anos, inclusive o desenvolvimento de uma raça de equinos dentro daquela região. Então a gente percebe que houve ali uma integração mesmo da natureza com o homem. Eu não me recordo de pragas que estão no Pantanal sem solução.
Terrific. I think why don't we go to another round? There was a question over here in the middle and then come back here. Lots of questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Juanita, and I'm Assistant Director at Amazon Alliance, and I had two questions. First off, I wanted to congratulate the Woodrow Wilson Center for the diverse panelists, and I know that we're all concerned about climate, and that's why we're all having these discussions. My question is about the process of bringing together indigenous peoples in the different initiatives that you've talked about. Specifically, there was mention on following Kyoto Protocol, but also the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights was just passed, as well as there's mention in the Convention on Biodiversity. So how are these processes adhering to some of these policies? My second question is specifically to Governor Maggi. I was just on Skype, nice technology now, with Brazil while we were in this presentation. And Goyabi, which is the National Organization of Indigenous Peoples, asked specifically if you could speak on how you're working on indigenous demarcation. What's the process that you've been doing, since historically indigenous peoples have a huge stake in the preservation of the forests in the Amazon?
Okay, terrific. And if we could go next down here.
My name's Sylvia Tognetti. I'm a consultant with various organizations. Most of my work has been on payments for watershed services. More recently, I've been looking at carbon. And my question is, goes back to the governance issues that John Carter talked about, which is, and in many cases, governance and particularly property rights are a prerequisite for implementing any kind of payments for environmental services. And so I would like to hear a little bit more, and in a lot of cases, or in some cases at least, we've seen that, recognition of rights are often part of a PES agreement. They're conditional on certain land uses, and it's in frontier areas, it's a way to stabilize, perhaps. And so I'd be interested in hearing some comments on that in this particular context, what it looks like on the ground.
Sure. And Sylvia, if you could hand that right behind you. The gentleman had a question? No? Okay, there. Yeah, one more.
My name is Ben Block. I'm a reporter with the World Watch Institute. And Mr. Carter mentioned that if there was a reliance on voluntary payments, then there wouldn't be enough funding for the riparian zones. And so, but everything I'm hearing from the Brazil Fund and the deal with Marriott, everything's really reliant on a voluntary system of funding. So my thoughts are, or I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how could enough funding really be raised through a voluntary mechanism to address all of the issues, to raise enough money to solve all of these issues, and if whatever is decided in Copenhagen next year, if a funding mechanism is reached that would be a step away from a voluntary system, I guess what are your thoughts will happen if countries like Norway decide to go to a system where they or give money to a country where they'll get forest credits? What would happen to Brazil if everyone else is kind of looking at countries that are stepping away from a voluntary system? If that makes sense.
And if you could pass it just the other way, I'll take one final one in this round. Yep.
Thanks. I'm Mike Colby with the Natural Resources Management Office of USAID. And I also want to congratulate Governor Maggi, and I think he knows, but a lot of people probably don't, and John may know. USAID is going to be co-sponsoring with Governor Maggi a big Katoomba conference on PES in March or April, and then some follow-up work in Xingu and other parts, and we're very much looking forward to that. I'm trying to put together some things I've been thinking about with the comments on the watersheds, the water cycle services, the soil carbonation services, and all that stuff, and the implications for how payment system might work. To me, if you think about that, that means there are a lot of services that are benefits that are accruing to local people from learning how to farm in different ways that conserves the water, that conserves soil carbon. I have experience. I was in Kenya about 3 years ago, and the tea plantations along the Mao forest that 20, 30 years ago cut down all the native forests to plant eucalyptus for their fuel to replace oil. Now they're discovering that they're better off ripping out those eucalyptus plantations and replanting natural trees, native trees, because of the water problem that they caused, both in terms of the microclimate, in terms of the rainfall, and in terms of how much those non-indigenous trees sucked up the water. In Niger, because of decentralization of property rights over trees to local people, they've reforested almost 5 million hectares, and no one's paid them a penny to do it. All these, they're doing it based on local benefits of these ecosystem services. And so to me, the implication of that is, yes, there's a need and there's a benefit from having some international flows payments as part of this process. But I think it's a mistake when you do the accounting of the opportunity costs not to account for the fact that a lot of those benefits are accruing locally, and it's worth it for people to make some of those investments themselves. And I think that should be factored into the calculations when we're designing a PES system. A follow-up question, I was wondering, because of that, two questions actually. One is, carbon that's in the form of a tree or in the soil is very different than carbon that comes out of a pipe that's burned. It has all these other benefits, and therefore it's worth a lot more, all these other ecosystem services. And if I'm wondering what the panel's perspective on if we make forest carbon part of the carbon trading system, should it be a separate trading system from the emissions trading system, because it has so many of these other services involved, it's worth so much more. It's not the same as just trading for another molecule of carbon dioxide. I've got other follow-up questions, but I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, yeah, and we've given you a lot to chew on here with the variety, with the indigenous demarcation, property rights, voluntary versus another method for funding, and then these final questions. Who would like to?
I'll take a
Tom?
couple of them.
Okay.
On the question about demarcation of indigenous lands, that is a federal responsibility in Brazil, rather than a state responsibility, as far as I know. But in terms of the last point raised, I like to say that valuing a forest only for its carbon is like valuing a computer chip only for its silicon. And definitely we need to think about this in a more complex and richer way, whether that should be separate from or somehow linked with in a special case to the other parts of carbon markets. I don't have a strong opinion about it. I just want to see something that will really work in the end, and it'll come down to the details.
Let me add a note of urgency to what Dr. Lovejoy just said. If we can't find an incentive system for protecting the world's tropical forests in another, you tell me how many years, they'll be gone. If we don't find a way to turn around global carbon dioxide emissions in the next decade, globally, the chances for averting globally dangerous climate change will be much slimmer. So in the narrow time window that we have a giant engine that's revving up, getting ready to go, and that's the carbon market. Let's hitch the forest problem to the carbon market engine now, and that'll also buy us some time to figure out how to do the richer set of payments that that we obviously need.
Real quick, concerning the Indians, I've been adopted into one tribe. I took the governor's daughter there a couple months ago, and they're actively part of our system because the fires that start on the eastern side of the Shingo National Park, the prevailing winds throw them into the park, and that forest was not flammable 15 years ago. Now with deforestation and reduced humidity, relative humidity going down, they're going up in smoke. And I flew last year for an hour and a half, instrument conditions down to 200 feet above the ground, trying to land the Indians. I couldn't get there because of the smoke, the fire burning the park. So I think that's a real issue, and the Indians are a key player. There's a tribe that's near me, it was in my slide presentation, the Shivanshi. They're in a land dispute about a reservation. I have nothing to do with that, but nevertheless they're my neighbors, and they were starving. 7 of them died, and they were killing cattle on my property, and they started to fight with me, and I took it back to them, and ended up that the federal government didn't help me, and I saw the problem on my own, and now we've created a small herd for them of cattle. Have 150 head, and it's going to supply beef and protein for them. In the short term, kind of like what you're talking about carbon, to buy time, they go through a reforestation project there with carbon. The carbon to come in and provide those guys with income. So there are activities in the state that are happening with Indians. As far as the land title issue, and part of our system is a due diligence process where the landowner has to prove title, and so. It's a tremendous responsibility. It's very costly, and the state of Mato Grosso has a actual project called MT Legal Mato Grosso, MT Legal, which they're trying to do that. They're trying to get the whole state and put it to the system and prove documentation, which is the most important thing, is like the Minister Mangabeto Unger says. Carbon, the voluntary carbon market, there's tremendous amount of money there. It's just $4 carbon doesn't pay to reforest $2,000 a hectare riparian zones. Okay, how many years you take 4 times $80 a year in carbon times how many years? Come on, it's not going to work. We need to get the price up, and that's what we're trying to do in our project. And as far as the analogy with Africa, 5 million hectares, that's a phenomenal deal. But I want to know what they were producing per hectare. What was their return per hectare? Because in your Mato Grosso, and you're producing 55 bushel soybeans, and in a good year you can make 400 reais per hectare. That's a big obstacle to reforestation, and the money is not there to reforest right now. So we have to take all these things into consideration really when it comes down to how we're going to make this work. And carbon is the lowest hanging fruit we have in the short term to buy time.
Com respeito às reservas indígenas, o Sr. Lovejoy tem toda a razão. A demarcação de terras indígenas pertence à União e não aos estados. Toda a política indígena é dita pela União brasileira e também por um órgão chamado FUNAI. Eu espero que a Juanita, disse que falou com alguém de lá agora pelo Skype, tenha falado dentro de uma reserva indígena com o Skype. Isso demonstra muito claramente de que os índios que nós temos no Brasil hoje é muito diferente dos índios do romantismo que se fala sobre eles. São índios que estão muito próximos da cultura branca, que têm a necessidade de produtos dos brancos e que, em função das políticas dos últimos anos no Brasil, a população indígena tem crescido bastante. No meu estado tem crescido muito a população indígena. E isso, aparentemente, a primeira solução é ampliar suas reservas, o que não é correto, porque a população indígena vai continuar crescendo. Poderá chegar o dia, então, que todos os brancos teremos que sair do Brasil para que os índios fiquem lá. Então, essa não é a solução. A solução de fato, respeitar a cultura indígena e integrá-los, de uma certa forma, dentro de um sistema produtivo, a partir das suas... dos seus bens que tem, da sua cultura, transformá-los em também algo produtivo, porque o cacique Raoni, por exemplo, que é um índio conhecido no mundo inteiro, ele diz à minha esposa Terezinha, que é secretária de Trabalho, Emprego e Cidadania no Estado, como é que eu vou resolver o problema do meu neto? Não é mais do filho dele, é do neto dele. Como é que ele vai resolver? Porque ele sabe que a ampliação pura e simples e cada vez mais reservas não vai resolver o problema dos índios. Então é uma questão que nós precisamos de fato trabalhar, mas penso eu que os trabalhos devem ser muito mais dentro das reservas, trabalhando com os índios, desenvolvendo alguma atividade que não mude as suas características, mas que eles tenham oportunidade também de ter acesso às coisas dos brancos. Todo índio hoje tem televisão nas suas aldeias, tem carro para andar, eles não vivem mais sem as coisas dos brancos. É assim que funciona. Na prática é assim que funciona. Então, simplesmente ampliar as reservas não vai resolver. No estado de Mato Grosso, hoje nós temos 14% do território já definido para os índios. E na proporção que está se pedindo, nós vamos chegar a 20% dentro de pouco tempo. E nós dissemos antes também na nossa fala, e os outros meus companheiros aqui disseram, que para a agricultura nós temos apenas 8% do território. Então, a questão dos índios nós estamos discutindo. O Estado, apesar de não ter a responsabilidade de políticas indígenas, tem feito muitas políticas com os índios. Um relacionamento nosso é bastante bom, bastante fraterno, e o Estado de Mato Grosso tem colocado sempre a seguinte questão: em algum momento, se alguma reserva indígena do meu estado for invadida por brancos, o governo, como disse, apesar de não ter essa responsabilidade, é o primeiro a ir socorrer os índios, porque acredito que o território que é determinado e definido como deles não pode ser alterado. O grande problema é quando se quer aumentar as reservas, aí você cria confusão com os brancos que estão ao redor, porque vai-se em cima da propriedade privada de cada um, que é de direito dele, que ele comprou do Estado ou que ele comprou de um particular. Então se cria algum tipo de conflito. Mas graças a Deus os conflitos no nosso estado eles têm sido muito mais verbal, né, documental, do que conflitos armados. Felizmente nós não temos isso no nosso estado.
Eu gostaria de fazer só uma consideração, acredito que está indo para o final. Muitas vezes nessas discussões nós falamos de remuneração através de carbono sequestrado. Eu acredito que isso é muito importante, isso realmente tem que acontecer, mas o que nós estamos tentando dizer também, nós que eu digo, os produtores que estão lá no Mato Grosso, é que precisa-se também de uma remuneração por serviços ambientais prestados. Porque nós somos pecuaristas, nós somos agricultores e nós queremos ser, fazendo uma alegoria, nós queremos ser jardineiros também. Ou seja, nós queremos cuidar da floresta que é de todos nós. Quando eu digo nós agora, eu me incluo na população do mundo. Então existe uma diferença aí de pagamento por carbono sequestrado e de pagamento por serviços ambientais prestados, que é justamente essa ligação que nós temos com a floresta, esse cuidado que nós temos com a floresta. E isso, como já foi dito nessa mesa aqui, isto é urgente, não podemos mais esperar. Eu acredito que a partir de reuniões como essas, nós temos que realmente encontrar a solução, porque infelizmente, apesar de a gente ter mostrado os números de diminuição de desmatamento, a floresta está sendo destruída. E está sendo destruída para a sobrevivência de pessoas que estão lá, que também fazem parte e utilizam o meio ambiente. Portanto, é premente que nós façamos aí o modelo matemático, o conceito de remunerar os produtores que são pecuaristas, agricultores e querem ser jardineiros também.
Well, I'd like to put some comments in this discussion also. This is my particular opinion about this payment for environmental services. Some years ago, scientists came and told us that environmental conservation is important for everybody in the world. As Governor Maggi said, we have some problems to understand that as farmers, but now we agree that there is a value for everybody if we keep conservation areas in our farms. But this is a new business right now. Nobody knows, nobody can tell right now, I believe, how much will this worth in the future and how are we going to explore this new business, okay? So when you said, I don't remember your name, Mike, when you said that maybe these efforts to preserve nature will lead to economical contributions itself for the farmers, I agree with you. But right now, the key for mainstream conservation is payment for environmental services. I have no doubt about that, because it's like a subsidy. You need to promote this new business for it to become a big business in the future, and maybe in the future you won't need more any type of payment for that, because it's going to be a new and good business in the future. But right now, for this to become a good business, the key is payment for environmental services.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Well, that's, I think, a very, unfortunately for time, we have to end, but a very positive note to end on in terms of as we look for creative ways to really tackle these problems. Understand that there are a lot of interests that can be served with some of these common mechanisms, and that the challenges are tremendous, but nevertheless we have some real leaders both here in front and in the room in tackling them. Governor, thank you very much for your opening statement and your comments throughout. I think it's been a terrific panel and some very, very good questions and challenging questions. I know Paulo Sotero would say thank you very much on the Brazil Institute's behalf. Tell you to come back tomorrow for a full-day discussion on Brazil-U.S. relations. Urge you to come tomorrow night at 6 p.m. for an art exhibition. So it's really kind of a Brazil week here at the Wilson Center. So it's my pleasure to say thank you to all of you, ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for a very dynamic session.